welcome to the 7th session of the Frank Talk Radio Dialogues, an initiative by the Steve Biko Foundation, proudly sponsored by YFM as well as the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. I'm your host, Faith Mangop, and we're broadcasting live from the YFM live space. Now, the 25th of May marks the 50th anniversary of the Organization for African Unity. We've come to know it as the African Union. The question that we'll be posing to you tonight, therefore, is what does it mean to be an African? What does it mean to be an African? Remember, if you would like to participate in our discussion, the number to dial is 011 772 0992. Make use of our Twitter page, and that Twitter handle is @Biko Foundation, @Biko Foundation. And of course, you're more than welcome to listen to us by our online streaming. And I'm actually going to pose this question to you as well as a listener. If you're listening right now, what does it mean being an African? What does being an African mean to you? I'd actually like to welcome our panelists for this evening. We've got Ms. Diepolo Peko, who is a policy and economic analyst. We've also got Mr. Akino Motoso, who's an acclaimed actor, filmmaker, as well as director. We've got YFM's own Zimasa Lukwana, who's YFM's face-off producer, as well as Smash Africa, which is YFM's Drive Time co-host. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you, Faith.
Now, I'm actually going to open it up as well to our in-studio, to our live studio audience. What does being an African mean to you? Because we want to be discussing this throughout the show this evening, and we're hoping that we can get some feedback from you as well. I'm actually going to go straight into it. You know, Steve Biko had an article that spoke of how much confusion is sown even amongst Africans themselves, proposed the notion of an attempt being made at emphasizing the authentic cultural aspect of the African people by Africans themselves. But now when we're talking about being African, what are we talking about, Mr. Diepolo?
All right, I think when we speak about being African, we should be cautious about not being very essentialist about it. We're talking about right now Africa rising, African identity, and I've always argued that we need to think more about African identities because we are multiple beings, we are many things, and we reside in multiple spaces at any given time. And I've noticed that in the last while, there's been a tendency to try and talk about African culture, African tradition, and the African way. And I find that very problematic and very limiting because I think that when we speak about the African way and the African identity and the African culture, it then means that we are going to limit ourselves to one interpretation of it. I think a few years ago, for example, Wole Soyinka, he got some criticism over a book that he wrote where people felt that he was actually mythologizing a Yoruba identity rather than an African identity. For me, being an African means black, proud, amazing, clever, gifted. I think that's what we all are. But I also think it means being aware of the contradictions of our state. One of the things that's interesting about being an African that you don't get in other regions, you don't get a sense of people who have a shared history. Wherever I am in the world, if I see somebody from Kenya, it's exciting. It's like, oh yes, my brother. Or if I see a Ghanaian, it's exciting. You don't get that without, you don't get an Italian person being excited to see a Swedish person. You don't get an Indian person excited to see a Korean anywhere in the world. Or a Mexican person who's excited to see a Brazilian, for example. And that's something that's uniquely an African phenomenon, perhaps because of our shared history, the shared trauma, the African Holocaust that we've all been going through in different ways, not only for the past 500 years, but even previous to that. And I think that that is what makes the sense of connectivity that's part of being an African person in the 21st century very unique and very special. You know, you get your map of Africa, you don't get people's, and it evokes something special and exciting and incredible in most people. Nobody gets excited about seeing a map of America around their neck or a map of Italy. It's like, what's that funny thing that you're wearing around your neck? But, you know, the map of Africa evokes something extremely special. The question of what makes us African, it's all things and many things. It's dynamic, and it's evolving all the time. And one of the things as well that I think I'd like to say is we need to not only get away from the notion of us sitting under a tree and building up myths and mythology about how great we were, but I think that we need to understand that the tree is only part of the branches of who we are in our multiple identities. So not only how great we were, but how great we are, how great we will be, and that there are multiple narratives and multiple identities that are taking place all the time, and African identities are evolving all the time.
Akeem, to you.
I would agree with what she said.
That is very short and sweet.
I think it's what she said. What excites me is that it's a continent of possibilities, and it's one that I've never wished to be anything else. But also I agree that one must be careful of minimizing it. That Africa is a lot of possibilities, and that's what's exciting. When she mentioned Wole Soyinka, but one of the things Wole Soyinka had said that I did like, or I do like, is he said, a tiger doesn't have to declare that it's a tiger. The tiger, when you see it, you know it's a tiger.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about being African. Like, I just feel like it doesn't matter which context you're in, wherever you are in the world, I'm that. So even if I lived in Korea or whatever, you still be an African. So what I like about African people is the idea that you can be local everywhere.
That's right. Wow, I don't know what to say now because you guys stole my answers. But in a nutshell, right? I'd like to as a young African man, I'd like to say it's us being proud of where we come from and what we stand for and what we've been taught, and us embracing who we are, us being confident. The ability to just randomly break into dance and song, and how we impose ourselves. And sometimes we come across as too confident, therefore arrogant and whatnot. And I think being African is being powerful. And there's this saying that being African is being beautiful. So I say it's powerful and beautiful at the same time. So yeah, that's me.
Wow, so much pressure. Look, being African to me is about knowing where you are in relation to the rest of the world. It's about knowing where you fit in, where you come from as being part of this continent. It's about seeing the bigger picture, where we're going, and developing this continent for later generations to come. That's what I think being African is.
It's a very difficult question, but let's talk a little bit. You mentioned one thing, that we need to be careful of limiting our depiction of what being African is, or our definition for that matter, because I'm saying this because a speech by President Thabo Mbeki titled I'm an African, he noted that African man, or an African man or woman, is also formed by the migrants who left Europe to find a new home in our native land, and those from India as well as China. Yet even in South Africa, on questionnaires, for example, you would find that when they ask you to tick on the box, you'll see colored, white, or African. How do we start moving away from such a big depiction of Africanism, because it is evident even at government level? Gentlemen,
look,
lady.
I think in terms of you saying that the government obviously uses such segmentation of races and people and divisions within people. I think my mic is off.
No, your mic is fine.
Oh, is it fine? Okay.
Yeah.
Look, I think unification and adoption of other races into an African context is important. But also, we should be able, as Africans, to identify ourselves. I think having such things on questionnaires and forms that we can segment a demographic is okay, knowing how you are servicing that demographic. That's what it's primarily for. As we said, we don't want to be defining Africans to other people. If you are African, you know you are African, or you should know that you are African.
What about you?
Quite frankly, I don't think everyone who resides in Africa is an African. And I know probably this is one of the boldest statements, but because situations like where you find an African moving overseas, right? There'll always be Africans first before they are considered European, or let alone American or Chinese. Fact, I don't think you'll even find a Chinese African guy. He's just African. And with that said, yes, we do have a lot of history with Europeans coming to our country and influencing the way we live. I think we're too quick to accept them, and we're too quick to let it be because of what we somehow know and we've learned through the times. But I think, with that said, not everyone that lives in Africa is African. I think black makes you African, or your genes, or your family tree makes you your heritage. So I think that's what makes us African, and that is African.
Akin, do you agree with that statement?
Don't they say Africa belongs to all who live in it? Offended somebody there. I think, you know, the thing about it is that it's really important to be careful about things. I do believe that Africa belongs to those who live in it. And I think that sometimes, just because you've had an interaction with missionaries or colonial, like you don't have to adopt everything from them. And it doesn't have to be, I mean, it's been a really negative experience, obviously, colonialism and that kind of stuff. But I think that if you're committed, I always start with the commitment. What is your commitment to the continent, if you want to go on in those tips? So I don't think just because, I think you can, on one side, people say, my brother, but you know, brothers and sisters can also hurt each other. So, and somebody who is quote unquote African can be so un-African sometimes, and then somebody who is quote unquote not from the continent displays certain things that we all seem to agree with, Ubuntu and all this kind of stuff. So I'm much more interested in the complexity of where we live, because I think if you can embrace the complexity, you can start to deal with some of the problems, like why in an African country you must be still filling out forms. That's all, you know what I mean, like things like that. So I'm a bit more interested in those complexities, because I think that's what makes it. But my thing starts with commitment. What is your commitment to the continent that you live in? And that's where it starts for me. You can't just come and pillage. You got to show something for it. And those who do that, that's why when people say, "Oh, they want to leave and they go to Australia," I say, "You must go to Australia.
Yeah,
leave or whatever. Go, because if you're interested in building the continent so they can reach the pinnacle of what hopefully can be, that's where it starts for me. That's your commitment to Africa. You can't just be black and show up and say you're African. Is what I'm saying.
But I do think that, you know, what young brother Africa here is touching on is the notion of belonging and African identity, and how we identify as being Africans. The notion of loyalty is critical. The notion of being embedded and sold out to the African cause is extremely essential to any notion of what being an African is. And this kind of hit and run opportunistic African identity that says I'm going to have a dual citizenship because I need to be able to access resources is really problematic. And I think that this is why there are some countries that don't even want to enable dual citizenship. You're one or the other. You're fish or flesh. You're with us or you're against us. Yeah. And there is no exit clause. There is no lifeboat for you when back to the UK or to America. When things get tough and get too hot, we burn together and we become ashes together, or we don't. And I think the notion of Pan-Africanism speaks exactly to that, to the whole idea that you are sold out and you are completely embedded and enmeshed and loyal completely, and identify with the causes and the struggles and the suffering of a certain people. If I'm not eating, none of us are eating. If you don't have anything, I'll give you half of my last piece of bread. That kind of complete loyalty. And just to go back to what you were saying, this whole black, white, Indian, polka dot, zebra, whole thing that we do in this country, that's a weirdly South African thing. We're the only country on this continent who are really apologetic about our Africanness, and black as a centerpiece of African, by the way. And let's go back to our history just for a second. Remember that not very long ago there were people who were called non-Europeans. Yeah. That was still us. And then suddenly when things changed, when African, and then we were natives, right? Yeah. We were Bantus, we were all sorts of things. We were everything except African, right? Now, post-1994, the notion of being African and being black is linked with economic resources, it's linked with economic empowerment. So every Tom, Dick, and Harry, and even Chinese people are now supposedly black because of BEE, using BEE criteria. And we have these very strange constructions of what an African is, some of which are extremely opportunistic. It's interesting that you mentioned the China example. And I'm not trying to bashing or anything. They're fine. They're good peeps. Some of them, no problem. But I am saying that we need to be very clear and unapologetic about what blackness means, what it entitles us to, but what it forces us to be, what it obligates us to be. I think everybody, for example, who calls themselves an African needs to be speaking an African language. I just don't get this. You can live here for 100 years, 200 years. You can't even say Kunjani, Dumela, but you're born and bred in KZN, you're born and bred in Free State, and you're still busy assassinating the names of people around you. You know, and because I can't be bothered to call you Sibongile, no, you must be Ruth. No, man. Sis. You know, for me, that kind of contemptuousness has no place in an identity that speaks to an African reality, an African exceptionalism. And it's just this apologeticness that is a very unproudly South African phenomena. Don't get Kenyans who are apologetic about being Kenyan, Nigerians, certainly not Zimbabweans, Zambians. No, it's us. South Africa. Italians are not apologetic about being proudly Italian. The Chinese are not apologizing. It's only us being ever making concessions, ever not wanting to offend, and ever wanting to appease. And I don't know why, and I don't know, well, I do know why, but I won't say it right now. Yeah. But, you know, ever wanting to appease and be apologetic. And it's kind of makes me sick to my stomach and really depresses me sometimes.
Yeah. Look, just to add on to that, I think there's absolutely no need to take away such questionnaires, government or otherwise, because I feel that how those questionnaires do, where you mark whether you're black, you're white, blah blah, etc., you're green or whatever, I feel it's for statistics. We need to gauge how and who we're giving services to. We need to be able to know that we are prioritizing Africans. Africans shouldn't apologize to anyone for prioritizing Africans or the African agenda.
But you know, can I add something before you actually finish, right? With the forms, it's quite interesting. I've met someone who actually said, no, I will not say I'm black. I'd rather choose other than choose black. You understand what I'm saying? And we also need to be proud of who we are. That's ultimately it. And it starts from the bottom and it goes all the way up. If people on the ground start saying, okay guys, let's try and fix this thing somehow, maybe the top will realize maybe there's a problem. I don't know.
Now we can hear that quite strong themes are coming from our panelists. We're going to be posing this question as well to our live studio audiences. What does it mean to be an African? What does being African mean to you? Different definitions coming out. And I think the one thing that resonates right now is the notion of pride. So I'm also posing this to you as well as a listener. 011 772 0992, that is the number to dial should you want to be involved in this evening's discussion. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back with more. We pose the notion, what does being African mean to you? Before I go back to my panelists, I believe that I've got a question from our in-studio live audience. Could you kindly state your name, your surname, as well as your question? Very quick, very brief, so we can go back to our panelists.
Oh, thank you very much. My name is, again, Wandile Khatebe from the University of Johannesburg. I would like to know from the panel is that, can they please truly define the roles of being an African, because you find out basic people actually say that being an African, it's all about being recognized as the citizen of the world, do you see? Because even though being a citizen of the world, we are not recognized when it comes to making this, am I correct? When it comes to making decisions for the world movement, in a sense of being actually undermined when it comes to taking strategical political decisions in the world community.
Bibila, would you like to tackle that, the roles of being an African?
Sure. If I've heard Abuti Wandile correctly, relating to like current geopolitical challenges, right? I think that we've got a lot of leverage. The one is that our economies are rising, you know, this whole Africa rising narrative, which is quite compelling, problematic but compelling and inspiring, okay? And what does this mean? This means that we're looking at a place where most of the world is in decline. Most of the world, the first world as we have known it before, is in decline economically. So America, 2008, the meltdown, Europe melting down in cascading in melting down, you know, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Ireland, etc. And I don't think it's a phase that they're going through. It's not like teenage acne or anything. It's actually over for them. Okay, it's actually ending, and this actually gives the opportunity for us, because our backs are no longer against the wall, and because we've been the outliers for so long, and have just been quietly getting on with our own African agenda, not stating that we're tigers, but just being tigers, and now the stripes are showing finally. It gives us the opportunity to really reconstruct our own international relations agenda and our own platform. It gives us the opportunity to look at spaces like the G20, which we occupy, the BRICS as well, our own regionalism, the SADC and COMESA, and how we really consolidate that with the relative luxury of knowing that we can self-finance a lot of our own agendas, which was probably the critique with previous NEPADs and others, which was international funding to fund an African agenda, which seems like a real contradiction in terms. But I also think that it gives us the voice. We are one of the few regions which has moral authority. I'm still really sore about what went down with, brother leader Gaddafi. Not because he was the greatest of the great guys, but because of the principle that was violated. And when that happened, and our articulations as a collective, and South Africa's articulations around that, which contributed to the environment in which he was decapitated in a really disgusting way. And my argument with that has been that we don't defend personalities, we defend principles. If we're not able to defend principles, tomorrow it's anybody. Tomorrow it's Bob next door. Tomorrow it's Uhuru Kenyatta. Tomorrow it's a Western agenda which is continuing to define and dictate to us who is and who is not. So, for example, David Cameron gets to say that he congratulates Kenya on wonderful elections, but he's not going to acknowledge a sitting sovereign head of state who has been chosen by the Kenyan majority. It's a damn cheek. We all had to sit around and say congratulations to George Bush after he stole 2 elections. What a damn cheek. So I think that we have the opportunity right now to be a bit bullish and to be a bit strident in our articulations. And we have, I think, an excellent footprint across the continent in terms of our own peace building, which has changed. The era of coup d'etats and really forceful removals of sovereignty has shifted for the most part. We're in a good place. You know, and I wrote an article ages ago where I said this is the best place in the world to be, and a whole bunch of people came after me. I'll say it again, this is the best place in the world to be. They can come after me, they can find me again and again. I'll keep saying it because it continues to be true.
I think just to add on, I feel that the rest of the world is scared of Africa. And to put an analogy, it's almost like we were one big soccer team, we played, we're losing, we never picked this one guy who was sitting on the bench, and now we look there and we realize that was our star striker. He was sitting on the bench, and that's who we are. We're Africa. We're the super sub that the world needs. We have all the minerals, we have all the growth, we have the direction. We scare everyone else.
Just to put a little bit of a span in the works, we've got Kwame Nkrumah, who said Africans have indeed begun to think continentally. In fact, and when we question that notion, is that notion really true? Particularly looking at the xenophobic attacks of 2008. Now, we're talking about the need for South Africans to start looking at themselves as Africans within an African continent. But we had the outbreak of the 2008 xenophobic attacks, which are still continuing today. And on the other hand, we've got President Guy Scott's comment about our own president, Jacob Zuma. What do we say about that, Akeem?
Which one?
Both.
I think the reality, I mean, the soccer analogy is nice because I also like using soccer analogies. The stuff is complex. So for me, you have to start from it's how do you, if you take the xenophobic attack, so how do you start to, if you yourself haven't dealt with your own trauma, how do you start to embrace the trauma of other people? I always feel like, I made a film about this called Man on Ground, and we've just taken it around various communities in Musina and Mpumalanga, and obviously we all know what happened today and what happened the last couple of days in Orange Farm. The headline in one headline says foreigners must go to camps and stuff like that. So, those things hold us back. But I think that it's part of the complexity of where we're at, not just in South Africa, but in the continent. So I agree, it is a good place to be. I agree, we have all the minerals. The problem is, why are we not running it the way, quote unquote, it should be run? If a simple person can sit in their house and go, but let's take Nigeria. I'll get back to that. But let's take Nigeria. Got oil for days. Nigerian oil is the purest in the world. The world wants it, but Nigeria has petrol shortages. Nigeria, you know what I mean? So I think until you start to deal with that history, and I have a slightly different thing when it comes to leaders. I do think that sometimes the leadership has let us down, but I don't think it's all on leaders' fault. I think people elect the people they want, and also I think that we all have to have a civic responsibility. That's why I talk about commitment. What is your commitment to what you're doing? So in Cape Town now, people are trying to get, you know, their asylum papers, which is a legal thing, renewed, and they're being hosed by the police.
Yeah.
Not to mention that the head of the AU is a South African woman. So for me, the struggle I have is this great idealism of the continent contrasted with the harsh reality of the floor. So be it xenophobia, or if you look at what happened in Mali or Somali pirates,
Yeah.
or Boko Haram, do you know what I mean? So I don't really have an answer for you other than that for me is the struggle we have. And until we embrace that, until we have people who are committed to building the type of societies that we want, we can speak African unity till we're blue in the face.
Yeah.
Zim, I'm gonna come to you right now. I believe that we do have a caller on the line. Kumo from Roodepoort. Kumo, good evening.
Hi, how are you guys?
Very well, thanks to
That's
you.
good.
Yeah, I'd just like to talk about the fact that, you know, when you're watching the news, all these different African countries where you see brothers and sisters turning against each other, like you shooting someone who somewhere down the line you're related to, and it's like it hurts, you know, to see that we're turning against each other for some reason which doesn't really make sense. Why do we have rebels who are shooting citizens? Why are we shooting down our African brothers and sisters? I don't get it. It's not because of a job. It's not. It can't be. It doesn't make sense.
Zim?
Okay, just to add on to what Akeem was saying, I definitely feel that an unstable Africa suits only one person, and those are the pillagers. Those are the people that have agendas. Those are the people that would reap economic benefits that are not being reaped by Africans themselves. I feel that the xenophobic attacks are very socio-economic. It's people's anger in a certain region of Africa that is misplaced in a group of people who are being competitive, economically active and competitive. Something as simple as, a lot of people don't know that Somalian people actually group together their money when they make spaza shops. When they decide that we're going to start spaza shops, it's not one person. They go as a group. They buy in bulk, which offers them discounts, which is why that Somalian people can offer the same water for a cheaper price. Our people don't know that. They go alone. They go and they go buy something. They're obviously going to put a price on it, and they don't buy in bulk, so obviously unit cost. And then someone who is South African is going to get there and say, how can he be selling the same water for 9 rand, and I can only sell it and add profit, and I can only sell it for 14 rand? Simple things like that. Work as a unit. They do that.
But also, I mean, on that point, you know, when we took man on ground around the country, there was a 21-year-old unemployed guy in Mpumalanga who said he had this great thing about, why is it that the first response is violence? Why do we go, you're selling the thing for 9 rand, let's burn it down? Why is it not, hold on a second, how can I learn?
Yes.
How can I learn from what you're doing so that I can also be empowered? And I found it ironic that this guy not ironic, but I found it interesting that this gentleman in Mpumalanga, a few weeks ago there was a headline on Fin Weekly. They had something called the shadow economy, where people were already in that headline or in that article, they were talking about, instead of burning down these shops, why are we not empowering? It's a very powerful country. And I'm one of those, I mean, I'm pro-African to the core, but I mean, it's also, I'm also happy to air some dirty laundry. But here's what I don't understand. A lot of South African, and I'm one of those, I mean, I'm pro-African to the core, but I mean, it's also, I'm also happy to air some dirty laundry. But here's what I don't understand. A lot of South African companies make a lot of money in a lot of African countries. So how there's a disconnect for me if we're talking about the pillage. There's a disconnect for me. You go to someone else's country, make money, but in your own country, we never see you come out and say, "Hold on, don't burn that stuff down." So then I also start to go, well, who does it benefit? It's like when someone is murdered, you have to look, you know what I mean? The police go as the closest person.
Yeah.
Who benefits from it? And if you look at the history of Africa, at each point where it feels like something positive is going to happen, somebody comes in from the left there and does, just causes chaos. And I guess that frustration for me is always a nightmare.
I think it's like this. We have growing pains. You break your arm and then it heals, and while you're about to actually go to physio and actually make your arm work, there's something wrong with your finger, and you don't know how to react to this. So anger is the only way you can actually, try and fix it, but it does not fix anything. But what we don't understand is we forgot how to ask someone for help. We forgot how to actually say, "Hey man, how you doing? How did you actually make this right?" I mean, it's free information. You understand? I'm interested because I want to do this and whatnot. We don't want to talk no more. We quit to be angry and start a fight and start burning things, and questions will be asked later, which does not benefit anyone in that situation. And we just need to draw back and chill for a bit and actually see where we come from as people, because we stress this Ubuntu thing a lot, And I think as South Africans, we forgot how much value that has instilled in the struggle, and the reason why we're here is because people decided to work together. And I think Africans should be proud of other Africans actually coming to their country. I mean, if you're South African and you see someone from Angola coming down, be proud. Be proud of your country and Angolans seeing that there's potential and there's somewhat of growth in our country. And you should also somewhat inspire people to also move abroad.
We're asking the question, how do we start getting South Africans to think more continentally? How do we get Africans to start thinking more continentally? More of those questions, more of those discussions after this quick break.
Speak with.
Thank you very much for that. Any other question? Very quick, very brief, name, surname, as well as your question or your comment.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Julia Sadiki. It's a comment. Being an African, one should be able to practice principles which are embodied within the methodology of the spirit of Ubuntu. You must be able to say, how do I empower people who are not in the same level in terms of thinking with me, so that they can be in the same level with you, so that they can be innovator of product. And then lastly, in South Africa, I don't think there is xenophobia, it's mobophia. This is service delivery protest which is done under the name of xenophobia, and which is done by a mob. That is mobophia. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Back to the panelists. Now, African nationalism basically has been proposed to be the instrument for the reunification of Africa. Now, at a policy development level, particularly when we're looking at foreign policy, how does that nationalism get introduced without infringing on one's sovereignty?
Are you referring to nationalism as in
The notion of being
Africa being one?
Yes.
Well, look, I think a lot people have the right to be sovereign. They have the right to rule themselves. I think we cannot, when it comes to micromanaging a group of people, obviously being a country, they have the right to rule themselves. They have the right to dictate their own laws, as long as a whole, on a macro level, Africa, the agenda is forward. When dealing with other people and the agenda is Africa, I feel that we should all reach consensus on how to move forward. But I don't know the factors that affect people in the north of Somalia, and I can't set a policy here, sitting here, that's going to affect them there. I feel that people should be sovereign in their own state, but when the agenda is macro and it involves Africa, Africans should reach a consensus going forward.
This whole notion of African unity and Africanism and Africanism, I suppose, it's an old conversation, but it remains as relevant then as it is now. And I think more so because we are certainly stronger as a collective. But I do think we need to be very clear about which unity we're purporting. there's economic unity, there's political unity, there's military unity, there's cultural, there is linguistic, there is educational, there are different sovereignties, I'd even argue to say, you know, cultural sovereignty, linguistic sovereignty, and these are some of the things that keep us apart, because once you start saying, you know, we're an African nation, we're African unity, then what's the official language? Do we all have to speak Swahili? Do we all have to speak isiXhosa? Do we all have to speak Yoruba? Do we all have to speak Amharic, etc., etc.? And I'd argue that the answer is yes and no. We should be who we need to be. But the complexities of this have been, to a great extent, they've been wrestled with by the European Union, which basically borrowed heavily from what should have been the Organization of African Unity and had the resources and the lack of interference to do what we wanted to do all along. And they've done so despite their own tribalism. And make no mistake that Europe is not united because they really like each other. Like I said before, you know, it's not like Italians and the French really like each other. Even though they're quite proximate linguistically, they can't stand each other's guts, really. And the British think that they're better than everybody else, and they don't want to use the euro, but they have this slight affinity. So they're wrestling along despite their contradictions, because number one, they understood that they were countries in decline. There were colonial forces whose colonies were all gone and diminishing. So it was a very opportunistic gathering of people. What I think we can learn from that is that it's okay to have contradictions, but it's okay to also wrestle with those contradictions and to do whatever we need to do to come together in some way. I think that where we're missing it a bit is an understanding that the times have changed. From when Nkrumah and Lumumba were saying these things, we hadn't had invasions to this extent. We hadn't had the great usurpation of our sovereignty. We hadn't had structural adjustment. Stuff hadn't happened to us yet. We didn't know that was such a big, bad world then. And a lot of our leaders hadn't yet been assassinated and chopped down in their prime for saying the things that they needed to say. You know, Lumumba was still alive, and, you know, these things were still so tangible. And you know, the stuff hit the fan, and what we now have, I think, is the opportunity to continue to consolidate on this so-called Africa Rising or Africa's Rising platform, but do so without ceding our sovereignty, and also do so using the structures we have. We have a SADC, we have COMESA, we have ECOWAS. We're actually already doing this. And I'm wondering whether we're not putting way too much pressure on ourselves to have a single currency, you know, whether we want to call it the Afro as opposed to the Euro and stuff like that. You know, whether we're just putting way too much pressure on ourselves, or whether we should just not continue to develop organically, but understand that at a particular point, we need to be at a particular point.
Let's take a question from our studio audience.
Okay, my name is Tembagazima Josie from University of Wits. Just going back to the previous discussion, I just want to know, does being African means you black? Because I'm black, and I wouldn't say I'm black and I'm proud. Judging from the experience I have in the past, being black has this stereotype attached to it, and you find young people wanting to change so they can look black American. I don't know, like, we're not really proud as young people, because I was speaking to one of my friends and saying being African means I'm poor, and some other people claim to being African and say other races, they don't know their struggle, like they've never been in the struggle because they were never colonized, they never experienced apartheid. So I just want to get the idea around, does it mean being African, I am black, so I have to claim it? The other race don't know my struggle.
Smash, I'm going to pose this question to you as a young person.
Wow, it's so crazy. We are suffering from an identity crisis as young people, based on the influence of media. You can't run away from that, okay? You'll find that more people would rather be on the internet, watch TV, than read a book about Africa. You find cartoon shows, for instance, dedicated channel, 24 hours. Stupid things that happen in America, we end up falling in love with them, you understand? But you never get a dedicated channel about being African and being proud of who you are. So certain things like that somewhat are the reason we are like this. And our parents have little say if some say per se. Only a few parents have actually influenced their kids to actually learn African languages, know African history, and so forth. You understand? So we are fighting not a losing battle, but a very uphill battle.
Another comment from our studio panelists?
Hello, I'm Shananisi. Quickly, I think so far the debate has been very airy-fairy in terms of what it means to be African. It's been a lot of kumbaya, and it doesn't really make sense to me. I think personally, firstly, when you look at being African, you need to be able to describe practically what it is that Africans do in the first instance. So Americans, for instance, see themselves as Americans through contributing to what's happening in their country, through ensuring that they work in their country, ensuring that whatever class they're in, they contribute to the American dream. So that sort of ideology is informed by certain histories in themselves. And I think this is what we need to look at in terms of being African. Thank you, that's much better. We need to look at what we need to look at in terms of being African, for instance. What does it mean to be African when it comes to ideology, when it comes to economics, for instance?
Yeah.
So when we say you're doing business in Africa, are you doing business in Africa with a socialist sort of organization or movement in itself? Because the communitarian element comes in within being African. That for me is practically being African. And more importantly, quickly, I think we also need to look at our history in itself. I think our violent history is a bad one. We don't want to talk about it, but I think there's a lot we can learn from that history in itself. Before Seseseko or Mobutu became what he became in Zaire, what did he do positively? Before Idi Amin, for instance, butchered people in the 8 years that he was a dictator in Uganda, no one would mention that he was probably, even though he wasn't very good at expressing it, but he expressing it, but he drove the cause of empowering African women in Uganda in itself. And that is the history that we need communicated in the first instance. And I think practically those are the things we need to look at. Ideologically, economically, and every other sense when it comes to actually practically building outside of just having those debates. Thank you.
Has the notion of being African been clearly, and the African and the ideologies that we just mentioned right now, been clearly defined and effectively communicated to the future custodians of this continent? That's the question we're going to be addressing after this very quick break. the notion and the concepts, we're talking about Pan-Africanism, for example, that we mentioned, and the African Renaissance, where Pan-Africanism is seen as the endeavor to return to traditional African concepts about culture, society, and values, as one of our as well as our audiences has just mentioned. Have those concepts then been clearly defined and effectively communicated to the future custodians of the continent? We're looking at young people now. Zimas, I'm going to start off with you and then Akim.
Just repeat the question quickly.
Have we clearly defined and communicated effectively those traditional ideologies, those values, those that make us African, in a way that you as a young person are able to continue with that torch, for example, and pass it on to your own children someday?
That's an unequivocal no. I'll say this from my own experience. I grew up knowing that I was part of something, but not knowing what that something was. I only got enlightened once I got out of high school, because we're very sheltered through our schooling, through the first 18 years, and you don't know how certain things fit into each other. You don't know economics. You watch the news, but you don't know what that actually means. You don't know what part of the world you're in. That's the world that I grew up in. We never really readily had things like internet, so on and so forth, to find out, hey, Google, Africa, what does it mean to everyone else that you're African? I feel that there was a lot that wasn't said by our parents. There was a lot that wasn't passed on. I mean, I remember distinctly asking my mother once, why is everyone so cuckoo gaga about Mandela? I actually asked that, and I was a youngster. I think I was in grade 7, and she was so gobsmacked. But that was more reflection on her and what she had not taught me or had not enlightened me about. So I feel that it became something that I only knew or started understanding what it means to be African when I started reading about the struggles of other African nations and our struggle in relation to the African continent.
I'd like to, before Akin actually jumps on, like obviously as a young person, I just you know, like he spoke about the ideologies that Americans have, you know, and how kids in primary school and preschool actually are taught certain American songs. You understand? And they're taught on how they need to be committed to their country and whatnot. We are given so many options. You can choose to be an extremist, hate whatever race that you want to hate. I mean, that's why we have racism in the country and it's still alive, you know. Or you could just generally just want to be a good person, you know, giving back to the community, helping those around you. So we are just confused with so much happening in the country, and sometimes our parents are lazy. They're also human beings. I mean, we can't run away from the fact that sometimes they're too lazy to teach us certain things that we need to be empowered or be inspired in the future.
Okay.
Just to quickly add to what he said, I always feel that what always lacks, to add on to the American sort of context, what always lacks is a shared vision for Africans. I feel that something as simple as Nelson Mandela's speech at the Rivonia trial is something that was so powerful, and I can say without any guilt that I only read that about 2 or 3 years ago, but that is a powerful piece of literature. That's someone who didn't understand, who thought, if I die today, I want to leave something that people can read and know about so that they can understand the ideologies that are based. In America was so fragmented. When they made the Pledge of Allegiance, it was so that all of the immigrants, all of the different people that were there could share one vision. That's what we lack. Sorry for taking on.
No. I think your points. I mean, I was just listening to what the girl was saying. The lady there. I think. You know, I always say, like, the fight is long. The fight is strong, and you know, the gentleman mentioned Kumbaya and all this thing. I mean, I just think, like, you have to start from somewhere, right? You have to have some ideals, and you touched on that you can be anything, and I think that's what Africa is. It's a place of infinite possibilities. So because it's a place of infinite possibilities, it's no surprise that there will be different things. Like I say, I love everything about being African, but I also struggle with a whole bunch of things. So I'm not with you with the Idi Amin thing. I think that you know, the leaders like that are problematic. The problem is that they come to define, and then that's where the stereotyping and that's where the sort of misconception you were talking about the media. So I could say I don't like a certain person because I don't like his policies. Somebody else might say all black people are like You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then that's where, for me, I leave the room, because I go, we're not looking at each other as human beings anymore. And I think that education is key, and not even you mentioned Nelson Mandela. I mean, growing up, I grew up in Nigeria, and growing up, my parents had that Nelson Mandela speech on their wall. So as a kid, it's just like you're reading these things. I knew that. Well, the key point, the one that everyone uses as an ideal. I fought against black domination. So growing up, that's what I saw, and I was like, who is this guy? And my father said, this guy is fighting for the rights of black people. He lives in a country where he's persecuted because of the color of his skin. Now, for someone who's 6, 7 years old, you start to go, what does that mean? What does it mean? What do you mean persecuted? What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? And that has led me on a journey of trying to understand this place that we live in. And when I speak of commitment, that's what I'm talking about. Is that, you can say what you like about America or Europe. I'm not that obsessed with those societies. I'm more obsessed with this society, with our continent, because each place has to be given its opportunity to grow. So if you want to talk about African unity, let's just start with the basics. We need visas to go to other African countries. In Europe, you don't need visas to go to. You know what I mean? If you're European, Italy, you can jump on the thing. You're there in France. Everywhere is 2 hours away.
Yeah.
If I want to go to Mozambique today, Mozambique, you need a visa when you get there. If I want to go to, Nigeria and South Africa, busy fighting about visas, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like, how can you even start to talk about it when you can't even go to the countries in peace? We're still obsessed with our own separation. So you can sit here and talk intellectually about it. But if I picked up the thing and said, tomorrow I feel like going to Angola, I have to go stand in line. Yeah. I'm like, you know what? I'll take my money and go to Europe. So I start from there. Until you start to break down those barriers, the idea that I can travel within my continent with ease, and not as some kind of Disney operation, not as some, look at the lions, look at that, but as a proper exchange, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Then we're on a hiding to nothing, and I just think that education is key, but you also have to teach pride, because the problem is we live in a world that is sliding. I mean, you look at Europe and you just go, but these guys are failing here. Yeah. But if you looked at the news, that's not the story you would get. Yeah. So you have to almost be doubly equipped to deal with that propaganda, but be careful that you also don't start believing your own propaganda, but that you use what this continent has. Natural resources dominate this place.
Now we have to wrap up this conversation, unfortunately, because we're slowly nearing the end of this show. But very quickly, I'm going to cross to each and every one of our panelists. Smash, starting off with you, in terms of a young person, Akin was mentioning the notion of breaking down those barriers. As a young person, as a young South African, we are told that we're the least traveled individuals in the whole African continent. How do we start breaking down those barriers very quickly?
We are. I mean, let's not even start with the monetary factor.
Yeah.
It's not cheap to travel. Some of our parents try to get us through school. Some of us, try to do something. It worked. But we need exchange programs. I think Africans need to look at Africa. In my school, they used to take kids from Germany, kids from the UK, kids from Japan, and they bring them. And I'm like, but why don't they bring someone from Ghana? Why don't they bring someone from Nigeria and whatnot? Yeah. We also need to start pushing that. And when I think our struggle is different now. We should actually fight for knowing what our brothers up in Africa are doing. Yeah. And they should also fight to know what our brothers in the middle of Africa are doing and so forth. We should just yearn and need information from one another so much that when we meet, it just works. And the unity aspect, it will actually work much better and we'll change ideas and Africa will be a beautiful place.
Diabola, very quickly.
Okay, African identity is multiple and really, really complex. I think we can design these things. I'm just remembering growing up in Zambia, for example, there was Humanism by Kaunda Seseko. To go back to what the brother was saying, he called it authenticity. And this was, about really allowing African music, African culture, the clothing, the identity to flourish. We can actually engineer identities if we put our minds to it. And we can engineer a sense of African nationalism and African identity if we put our minds to it. I do want to pick up the whole notion of xenophobia. It is not xenophobia, it is Afrophobia, the fear of other Africans. If it was xenophobia, the people in Chinatown, Cyril Dean would have been fearful. Oriental Plaza, they'd have been fearful. So I think we need to characterize this appropriately. But I think also to say that it is not a uniquely South African phenomenon. It is uniquely unacceptable, but it is not uniquely, Ivory Coast, there has been horrible Afrophobia against other West Africans there.
Yeah.
One of the most xenophobic or Afrophobic places to be in 20 years ago growing up was Zimbabwe. I remember going there and it was people looking down on us and saying, oh, you poor things, you're not free yet. Oh, tut, tut. Oh, you poor things, when are you leaving? Growing up in Zambia, and just to say that the welcome was with conditions. And it's also to do with the vanity and the arrogance of being a new state, and the scramble for resources, and the kind of inward lookingness that comes with that. You're so busy being in love with yourself and the newness of this new state that I think it also breeds a level of contempt that we need to be very mindful of.
Zamasa?
I think I'm going to take this from an economic perspective. I think that Africa needs to develop an Afro-capitalist approach to everything. We need to realize that because the market is free and fair, and I put that in inverted commas, we are free and fair to dictate the prices of a lot of things. I don't understand why when...
This session of Frank Talk Radio Dialogue is probably brought to you...
The markets, but they reside here. I don't understand why the price of... the price of a certain car, which I will not name, which is German, which is made here in Uitenhage, will cost more than the same car. The minerals are mined here, they moved to a harbor, shipped off to Asia, they manufactured, they brought here, and the price for that same car is cheaper in Australia. I don't understand. We need to have Afro-capitalist ideologies that are for us.
And that's how we're going to wrap up this session of Frank Talk Radio Dialogues, proudly brought to you by the Steve Biko Foundation as well as the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. This discussion will be continuing way after the show has ended, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank my panelists and thank you very much for contributing to this evening's Frank Talk Radio Dialogues. Absolutely mind-blowing stuff, as well as challenging our thinking of what it really means to be African. From our panelists, as well as our studio audiences, we'd like to say to you thank you and good night and God bless. And from ourselves and the team, we say to you, salute.